Ezra Whitmore stood in the stillness of morning, a silhouette framed in the crooked window of his one-room cabin, his broad frame blocking half the view. Outside, beyond the dusty clearing and broken fence line, 300 Apache warriors waited in silence. They had come with the sun, their horses restless, their eyes sharp and unblinking. From the ridge to the dry creek bed, from behind every rock and bush, they had appeared, methodical, coordinated, like the desert had given birth to them all at once. Ezra didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle. He stood barefoot, shirtless beneath a worn brown vest, his skin sun-leathered and marked by years of labor. His wide shoulders nearly touched the window frame. The brim of his weathered brown cowboy hat cast a long shadow across his brow, hiding the fear behind his pale blue eyes. His rifle rested against the wall, loaded, but untouched. There was no sense in it. He knew this wasn't a fight he could win. It had all started last night. He had gone out late, chasing off a coyote that had gotten too close to the chicken coop. The moon was a dim smear behind the clouds, the land cast in shades of gray and memory. As he passed the old well, he saw something slumped in the dirt, something that hadn't been there before. At first, he thought it was a deer, maybe a dying dog. But as he stepped closer, the thing groaned. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16. Apache by the look of her, skin bronze but pale from blood loss, long black hair tangled with sweat and dust. She was curled in on herself, a torn pale blue dress clinging to her frame, stained dark in too many places. Ezra's first instinct was the same one any man with half a mind would have out there. Walk away. Stay out of it. The whole territory was on edge, tensions between settlers, and Apache had been boiling for years, and a white man found with a wounded Apache girl on his land? That was a story written in blood. But she moved. A soft, broken sound escaped her lips. Not a word, just pain. Fear. Life refusing to let go. He knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. The pulse was weak, but there. "Hell," he whispered, voice rough from silence. "You're still here." Her eyes opened just a sliver, dark irises catching the moonlight. They didn't plead. They didn't panic. Just a steady, desperate will. Ezra lifted her gently, cradling her light frame like he might a wounded bird. Her head slumped against his chest, and he could feel the tremor of her breathing, shallow, ragged fluttering like wind through dry grass. He carried her inside. It had been 5 years since anyone had shared that cabin with him. 5 years since his wife had passed on a night just like this, quiet, cruel, without warning. Since then, the bed had been his, and only his. But without hesitation, he laid the girl there, pulled off her torn boots, gathered a clean rag and water from the well, used what little whiskey he had to sterilize the wounds. They were bad, slash marks on her arms, a jagged gash across her scalp, bruising around her ribs, and worse marks that weren't made by accident or nature. Someone had done this to her on purpose, and they hadn't expected her to live, she moaned when he cleaned the worst of it, muttered in Apache. Ezra didn't understand the words, but her voice was soft, almost musical beneath the pain. He sat in the wooden chair beside the bed through the night, not touching his rifle, not moving more than to check her breath every so often. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. He didn't sleep. He just watched the desert through the cracked glass, listening to the wind whisper things he didn't want to hear. Around 3 in the morning, she stirred again. This time she sat up halfway, wincing, her eyes wide and frightened. She pointed at herself. "Ayana," she rasped. Ezra nodded. "Ayana," he repeated slowly, gently. "All right." Then she pointed toward the door, toward the east, and said one word, a word that cut through him like a knife. "Father." He didn't know what it meant at the time, not really, But as the first glimmer of dawn painted the sky in strokes of copper and blood, the rumble began. Horses. At first, just a few, then more. The earth trembled under the weight of their approach. Ezra stepped outside, boots crunching on dry dirt, and watched as the warriors took position across the horizon. He counted a dozen, then 2 dozen, then stopped counting altogether. By the time the sun crested the edge of the mesa, 300 Apache warriors had surrounded his ranch. No war cries, no threats, just silence. And a single beat, the slow, rhythmic pounding of a ceremonial drum, carried on the morning wind like a warning from another world. Ezra stepped back inside the cabin, where Ayanna now sat upright, eyes wide, lips trembling. She saw the fear in his face. She knew what was out there. Maybe she had expected it. She whispered something quick, desperate. He couldn't understand her, but he didn't need to. He turned toward the door again, where sunlight was beginning to spill across the floorboards, one hand on the rifle leaning by the frame, the other trembling slightly as it reached for the brim of his hat. They were coming, and the line between right and wrong, between life and death, was about to be tested by every man, woman, and spirit watching that cabin in the dust. Ayanna grabbed his hand. He looked back, and she spoke 2 words in perfect, broken English. "They kill." The drumbeat outside stopped, and the world held its breath. When Ayanna opened her eyes again, she didn't recognize the ceiling above her or the scent of pine smoke that clung to the rough wooden beams. Her body ached in places she didn't understand. Her mouth was dry. The warmth of the bed beneath her was foreign, too soft, too clean. She sat up sharply, her breath catching, pain flashing behind her ribs like lightning. Her hand flew to her side, brushing against a cloth bandage. Her heart pounded in her chest, wild and erratic, and her eyes darted around the dim cabin. She was alone. A fire whispered in the stone hearth. Morning light slanted in through the window, revealing dust motes drifting like ash in the air. Beside the bed, a chair sat empty but worn from use. A blanket had been thrown across the back, and there was a tin cup half filled with water resting on the floor. The place was poor, but cared for. Ayanna's gaze dropped to her hands. Her wrists were bruised, her fingers scraped raw. Her knees were torn. She moved slowly, reaching down toward the hem of the tattered blue dress she wore. It had once been modest and pretty. Now it was stained with blood and dust, ripped at the seams, hanging crooked over her narrow frame. She remembered men shouting, the thud of boots on dirt, rough hands, the smell of leather and whiskey, and running until her legs collapsed beneath her and the stars blinked out overhead. A sound outside made her flinch, a door opening. She reached for something, anything, to defend herself, but there was nothing within reach. Just a ragged quilt and her own breath held tight in her throat. Then he appeared. A man. Towering, broad-shouldered, framed in the doorway like a mountain. He didn't speak, didn't move quickly. His hat shadowed most of his face, but his eyes, light blue and quiet, held no threat. She froze, waiting. He took off the hat, revealing short, graying brown hair and a face worn with sun and solitude. His hands were large, weathered, and calloused from work, not soft, not violent, but capable. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft creak. He didn't reach for her, didn't ask questions, just knelt down near the fire, poured water into the tin cup, and held it out at arm's length, as if not to spook her. Ayanna's breath trembled as she reached forward, her fingers brushing his as she took the cup. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but she drank greedily. He nodded once, then settled into the chair beside the bed, still silent, still watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. She tried to speak, but her throat was too raw. Only a hoarse croak escaped. He reached for something beside the hearth and handed her a folded cloth soaked in water. She took it slowly, pressing it to her cracked lips, her wide eyes never leaving his. Then she pointed first to him, then to herself. "Where?" she rasped. He hesitated, then said in a low, gravelly voice, "Ezra." He touched his own chest. She watched him for a moment, uncertain. "Ezra," she repeated quietly. She pointed to herself, lips trembling. "Ayanna." The name landed heavy in the silence, as if it belonged here, had always belonged here. Ezra nodded. Ayanna glanced around the room, uncertain, her fingers tugging at the frayed hem of her dress. She reached down slowly and pulled up her sleeve. Ezra's breath caught. The bruises were purple and black, already days old. But more than that, beneath them were slices, thin, deliberate cuts, patterns almost, not random, not defensive, purposeful, ritualistic. She held his gaze. He didn't look away. He stood suddenly, walking to the shelf and grabbing a clean strip of linen. He dipped it in water and returned, holding it out without a word. She took it, her hand shaking. The pain in her side worsened, and she leaned back with a wince, her body slumping into the mattress. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Ezra moved to the edge of the bed and adjusted the blanket around her. She flinched, but he paused, raising his hands in a quiet gesture of peace. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said gently. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone settled something inside her. He looked at her wounds again, at the way they lined her arms and collarbone. Someone had marked her, like livestock, and that meant they'd come looking for her. He stood again, pacing. His boots thudded lightly on the floorboards as he moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. Still quiet out there, but he could feel it. Ayanna watched him. Then, softly, she whispered a word. "Father." Ezra turned, the word hanging in the air like smoke. He stepped closer. "What?" She pointed to herself, then toward the east. "Father," she said again, voice barely audible. Ezra crouched beside the bed. "Your father." She nodded once, her eyes filled with something fear, grief, hope, he couldn't tell. Her hand clutched the blanket to her chest, her other hand clenched into a trembling fist. And suddenly he understood. Not only was she someone's daughter, she was someone important's daughter. He leaned back against the wall and stared at the fire for a long moment. A chief, maybe, a war leader. If so, then the silence outside wasn't peace. It was the calm before a storm. And by sheltering her, tending her wounds, he might have crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He looked at the girl again. She was no criminal, no spy. Just a child who'd been taken, brutalized, and left to die. And now she was alive because of him. His jaw tightened. He wasn't sorry for saving her. He didn't regret that. But he did regret not boarding up the south fence better. Regret not saddling the horse sooner. Regret that he'd used the last of the coffee 2 mornings ago and hadn't gone into town to get more. Things were going to change. Outside, a gust of wind caught the edge of the curtain. The horses in the corral began to stir, whinnying low. Ezra's body tensed. Ayanna heard it too. Her eyes widened, searching his face. He moved quickly, crossing to the window, and there, just beyond the edge of the clearing, he saw them, silhouettes in the rising light. Horses, at least 20. And more coming behind them like the desert itself was birthing warriors from the dust. He stepped back from the window, heart pounding. "They're here," he murmured. Ayanna sat upright, ignoring the pain. Her breath hitched as she looked toward the window, as if she could feel every hoofbeat striking the earth. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Too many." Ezra reached for his rifle, and for the first time Ayanna didn't look afraid of him. She looked afraid of the people coming for her, and that told him more than any words ever could. The drums started again, low, measured, closer now. Ezra stood between her and the door, every muscle tight, his hand resting on the wood stock of the rifle. Ayana, bruised and bloodied, sat up straighter in the bed, her eyes locked on his back. Not pleading, not begging, just waiting for him to choose. And outside, the number of riders was growing fast. The morning light came in soft at first, spilling through the trees in thin streaks, catching on dust in the air like gold threads. But beneath that fragile beauty was a sound that made Ezra Whitmore's blood run cold. Hoofbeats, not the slow amble of cattle or a traveler's steady trot, but something else entirely. Rhythmic, fast, too many to count. Ezra stepped to the window and pulled the curtain aside with 2 fingers. They were coming. From the ridges, from the creek bed, from the folds of dry earth where scrub and shadow had once disguised them. Riders emerged by the dozens, fanning out into a wide crescent that swept across the edges of his land like the jaws of some ancient beast. They were Apache. He recognized the paint on their faces, the war feathers and leather armor, the gleam of sunlight against rifles and longbows. They moved with discipline, not chaos. This wasn't some ragged posse or aimless revenge band. This was a war party. Ezra let the curtain fall. His cabin, his fence line, the dry well and weather-worn barn, all of it was now a dot, surrounded on every side by circling riders. In all his years out here, he'd never seen anything like it, not even when raids flared up across the territory. This wasn't a warning, it was judgment. Ayana sat upright in the bed, hands gripping the blanket. Her eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting more than fear. Recognition. She whispered something, fast and low, but Ezra couldn't catch it. "What's out there?" he asked, though he already knew. Ayana reached for the edge of the bed to rise, wincing as she tried to swing her feet to the floor. Ezra moved toward her, gently stopping her with a hand to her shoulder. "They're not going to storm the place," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not yet." From outside, the hoofbeats slowed, forming into a pattern that spread across the land like thunder rolling across stone. Drums began to sound again, not distant this time, but near. Right there at the edge of his land, like the earth itself had begun to speak in war rhythms. Ayana flinched at the sound. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Too many." Ezra took a step back toward the door, feeling the wood floor creak under his boots. His heart pounded in his chest like it was trying to outmatch the drums. Then he saw movement. A lone rider approached, slow, deliberate, young but confident, his long hair tied back, a rifle resting across his lap. He was dressed in dark leather and carried himself like someone used to commanding attention. He stopped just beyond the fence line, horse still beneath him. From that distance, his voice came clear and strong. "White man," he called, "you have something that belongs to us." Ezra stepped outside, staying on the porch but keeping the door ajar behind him. The morning air was cooler than he expected. The sun hadn't yet risen fully, but already its light was spilling across the plains, catching the figures on the hills and reflecting off spear points and gun barrels. The sheer number of warriors made Ezra's breath catch. At least 100 visible from here, and that was just what he could see. "I found a girl," Ezra called back. "Near my well, she was dying." "That girl is our blood," the rider said. "She belongs to the people." Ezra felt the weight of the door frame behind him, the cracked wood pressing into his spine. His rifle leaned against the wall just inside the cabin, but he didn't reach for it. "She didn't have a name when I found her," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Just bruises, cuts, and blood." The rider's eyes narrowed. He pointed. "You bring her out." Now, inside, Ayana had moved to the doorway, her injured hand clutching the frame for balance. Her lips parted, and she said it softly but firmly. "No." Ezra turned halfway, his body still shielding the entrance, his eyes on her. She shook her head once. Her entire frame trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. "No," she repeated. "Please." He turned back to the rider. "She's not ready." "She's hurt bad." The rider adjusted his reins. "Then bring her out, or we take her." "You'll have to step foot on my land to do that," Ezra said. It wasn't a threat. It was a line drawn in dust. The rider didn't answer. Instead, he whistled sharply. From all sides, the warriors responded. They shifted into tighter formations. A line of archers stepped forward along the southern ridge, bows drawn. Others moved to flank the cabin, their rifles aimed low but steady. Ezra felt something shift behind his ribs. Not fear, exactly, something older. Something carved from the part of a man that doesn't ask permission to do what's right. He stepped fully onto the porch. "I didn't take her," he said, louder now. "She came here broken. She's still bleeding. If I give her to you now, she won't survive the ride back." The rider didn't respond, but a second voice did. From behind the wall of warriors, deeper and more weathered, a voice barked something in Apache. The young rider flinched, glanced behind him, and rode back into the formation. Ezra saw the shift immediately. Someone else had arrived. Ayanna did too. Her face went pale. She whispered a word Ezra didn't understand, then slowly sank back to the floor inside the cabin, as if her strength had been ripped from her all at once. The drums stopped. Silence. And then, from the far ridge, a new rider appeared. Older, wearing a full headdress lined with silver and black, the colors of authority. His horse moved slow with purpose. The warriors parted like water as he passed. Ezra didn't need a name. He knew this man. Not personally, but by role. This was the chief, the father, the one whose daughter now sat behind Ezra's door, refusing to return. Ayanna's voice came again, quieter this time. "He'll kill you." Ezra didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the man descending the ridge, and whispered to her, "Not before I find out why you're afraid of going back." The chief stopped halfway across the field, not yet within shooting range, not close enough for conversation. He raised his hand once, and every warrior on the field froze. Ezra watched him. The weight of it pressed down like thunder. Whatever came next, it would not be words. The sun broke fully over the hills then, casting the land in blood-colored light. Ezra didn't move. Neither did the chief, but something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. Because when the chief finally did speak, it wouldn't be with demands, it would be with judgment. The silence held like a drawn bow. Ezra stood square on the porch, watching the chief, waiting for the moment when words might come, or violence might thunder down instead. But something shifted on the southern ridge, a flash of movement in the early sun. A new rider broke from the horizon, tearing across the red dust like a hawk diving from sky to prey. The Apache warriors tensed, parting just enough for the horse to pass. Ezra's hand inched toward the rifle beside the door, but he didn't lift it. Not yet. The rider was younger than the others, mid-20s maybe, broad-shouldered, scar on his jawline, black hair braided down his back. His mount kicked up dust as he drew closer, but he didn't come in slow like the others. He rode hard, not toward Ezra, but toward the chief. Then he veered again, this time toward the cabin. Ayanna stirred inside. She'd been curled up against the inner wall, barely moving since the chief had appeared. But when she heard the sound of that second horse, something in her shifted. Her spine straightened, her breath caught. Ezra turned and caught her eyes. She stared through the window. The rider shouted as he neared. "Ayanna!" His voice cracked like gunfire, raw with fear and something deeper. She bolted up. "Kota," she whispered. Ezra stepped aside just enough for her to reach the doorway. Ayana leaned on the frame, her knees still weak, but she stood tall enough to be seen. Her brother pulled his horse to a sudden stop, just a few feet beyond the porch. He dismounted fast, boots striking the dirt. Ayana didn't run to him. Not yet. She stood there trembling, watching his face shift from panic to disbelief, to fury and back again. Then she stumbled forward, and he caught her in his arms before her legs gave out. Kota cradled her tightly, murmuring in Apache, rocking her slightly the way you might calm a wild animal or a broken child. Ezra stepped back into the cabin, giving them space. For a moment, the world narrowed to brother and sister, war party and rifles forgotten. Kota eased her down onto the porch bench. Her hair stuck to her cheeks in messy strands, and the sun caught the bruises still fresh along her collarbone. He looked her over, then glanced up at Ezra standing in the doorway. "You found her?" he asked. Ezra nodded once. "She was near my well." Half-dead Kota's jaw clenched. "She's my sister," he said. "They took her 3 nights ago. Gone before we could stop them." "She didn't have a name when I found her," Ezra said. "Just pain." Kota looked down at Ayana again. She reached for his arm, gripping his sleeve with surprising strength. She began to speak in Apache. Fast, urgent. Ezra couldn't follow, but her voice cracked and faltered and rose again. Her hands moved, pointing to her ribs, to the old cut on her head, then to Ezra, repeatedly. The tone in her voice wasn't fear now, it was fierce. Defensive, she was protecting him. Kota listened without interrupting, but the more she spoke, the more the nearby warriors shifted uneasily. A few muttered among themselves. Some turned and spat into the dirt. Others just stared, their faces locked in unreadable tension. When Ayana finished, her brother remained quiet. His eyes flicked back to Ezra. "She says you helped her," Kota said, voice flat. "Says you treated her wounds. Gave her shelter, gave her your bed while you slept in a chair. That's the truth. She says you never touched her. Never tried to take anything." Ezra's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I wouldn't," he said. Kota studied him for a long moment. "You say that like it's supposed to be ordinary." "It's not. Not out here," Ezra didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He knew Kota was right. Out here, the world broke good men and fed the pieces to worse ones. Kota turned and addressed the warriors in Apache. His voice carried, sharp and commanding. Some of the men nodded, others crossed their arms. One older warrior near the southern fence barked back in anger. The chief hadn't moved. He sat on his horse like a statue carved from ancient grief. Kota finished speaking and turned back to Ezra. "They don't all believe her," he said. "Some think you're hiding something. Some think you're just a smart liar. Are you one of them?" Ezra asked. Kota's mouth twitched, but it wasn't quite a smile. "I've seen enough liars to know they don't let someone sleep in their bed while they guard a door with no lock." Ayana reached for his hand again. She said something in Apache, softer now, like a plea. Kota looked back to Ezra. "She says you called her safe when she couldn't understand you. She says your voice told her more than your words." Ezra swallowed hard. "I didn't save her for thanks. I did it because she was broken. Same as I was." Once Kota glanced back at the warriors again. The ones on the outer ridge were starting to shift their horses. Not retreating, just restless. "She's our chief's daughter," he said. "Blood of blood. If she died on your land, there'd be no talking right now. I figured. But she didn't. Because of you," Ezra said nothing. Kota nodded toward the cabin. "You still got food?" "Beans and jerky." "Then feed her." "Why?" "Because the next man who rides in won't be me. And he's not coming to talk. Ezra stepped aside, letting Ayana and Kota back into the cabin. She sat slowly on the edge of the bed, her brother beside her, still watching the world through slitted eyes. Ezra poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. For the first time since arriving, she looked like someone who believed the danger might not swallow her whole. Ezra returned to the door. The ridge was changing again. The chief had dismounted, and now he was walking, slowly, alone. Each step measured. Behind him, the warrior straightened. Ezra felt the weight shift again. Kota rose from the chair, reaching for his knife, without thinking. Ayana grabbed his arm. She shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Not yet." But her eyes never left the window, because she knew as well as Ezra did. The father was coming. And this time he wasn't coming with questions. He was coming with judgment. Chief Nal Nish walked with the gravity of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command fear. He wore no war paint, no rifle, no pistol. Only the long, sun-faded robe of a leader, a headdress streaked with silver thread and hawk feathers, and eyes that had seen generations of blood drawn in both justice and revenge. The warriors flanking the ridge stepped back without a word as he passed, even the younger ones. Those who gripped their weapons with twitching fingers and flared nostrils lowered their eyes. Ezra didn't move from the doorway. He watched as the man approached across the brittle earth, boots silent on the dust. Behind him, Ayana gripped her brother Kota's arm, her breath short and shallow. She whispered something in Apache, but Kota gave no answer. Ezra could feel the pulse in his neck. Chief Nal Nish stopped just 10 feet from the porch. His face was carved from stone and shadow, lines etched deep across his forehead, a long scar cut from the bridge of his nose to the corner of his mouth. His stare was not hostile, but it was absolute. He raised his hand. The wind stopped. The horses behind him quieted. The warriors, even those on the far hills, froze. He spoke in low, heavily accented English. "You have my daughter." Ezra's voice didn't waver. "I found your daughter. Near my well. She was dying. You brought her inside." "I did." "You touched her." Ezra squared his shoulders. "I treated her wounds, washed blood from her head, bandaged her arms. I never raised a hand to her." Nal Nish tilted his head slightly. "And why?" he asked. "Because she needed saving." The chief's gaze narrowed. "There are men who see a wounded girl and take. Men who see an Apache girl and destroy." Ezra nodded slowly. "I've seen them too. I ain't one of them." "Yet you are white," the chief said, stepping once closer, "and she is mine." "She's her own," Ezra answered. "She just happens to belong to you too." A flicker crossed the old man's eyes, but it was gone in a blink. "She tells me you gave her your bed, sat guard while she slept, never laid a hand, not even in the dark." "That's right. She says you whispered to her when she was fading, that you told her she was safe, even when she didn't understand your tongue." Ezra didn't answer. "She also says she woke to find your wife's picture on the shelf and whiskey on the cloth that dressed her cuts. These are things of care, of remembrance." Ezra shifted slightly, not defensively, but to take the weight off a knee that had been giving him trouble for 2 years. "I lost my wife 5 winters ago," he said. "She was the only thing I ever called mine. And since then, I've kept mostly quiet, mostly alone. But when I found your daughter on the ground like that, all that went away. There wasn't a choice. Not really." Nal Nish stood very still, his face unreadable. Behind Ezra, Ayana stepped forward to the doorway. Her arm was still wrapped in linen, one side of her face swollen, but she stood straight. Her voice shook. "Father." He didn't look at her at first. Then he did, only for a moment. She spoke in Apache, soft and urgent. Ezra didn't need to know the words. The tone said everything. Trust him. I lived because of him. He is not the others. The chief let out a long breath. Not tired. Measured. His voice dropped even lower. You do not understand what this means, he said to Ezra. To touch the daughter of a chief. To keep her without permission. In another time, another day, there would be fire already. Blood. I figured as much. And yet my daughter is alive, whole as much as a woman can be after what was done. That complicates vengeance. Ezra's hand twitched at his side. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I didn't do this to earn favor. Or land. Or trade. I just did what a man ought to. Now Nish stepped closer. Ezra could see now the fine cracks in his skin, the necklace of bone that hung at his throat, the fingers scarred, old but steady as stone. You did what was right, he said, but right does not mean safe. Ezra held his gaze. The chief raised his voice slightly, and though he spoke to Ezra, the words were for all the warriors who waited across the land. My daughter lives. This man did not harm her. He protected her with nothing to gain. But trust is not a gift freely given. It is a thread across fire. He turned his head slightly. You walk it now, cowboy. Ezra didn't speak. You are not condemned, the chief said, but you are not absolved. What am I then? Ezra asked. Now Nish's jaw tightened. You are between. One wind shift from friend, one misstep from enemy. Ezra exhaled slowly. I've lived most of my life there. The chief stared at him a moment longer. Then he turned and walked away. Not rushed, not retreating. Simply moving on. Ezra stood still, sweat on his brow, hands cold. He knew that wasn't mercy, that was calculation. A decision postponed, not resolved. Ayana sank back into the cabin's shadows. Kota watched his father's back as he disappeared into the lines of horses and still warriors. Ezra didn't move from the doorway, because now, for the first time since all this began, he understood the weight of the next decision. And it wouldn't be his. It would come from the one warrior who had yet to speak, the one whose silence had been building like a storm on the ridge. The sun had crested high over the hills now, and the shadows on Ezra's land had shifted from long and soft to sharp and tense. Dust swirled in the air like something unsettled. The quiet that followed Chief Nal Nish's retreat was thick with unease. But it didn't last. The stirrings began first among the younger warriors' men, shifting in their saddles, murmuring to one another in tight circles, fingers twitching near weapons. Then a low voice rose above the murmurs, not loud, but sharp and unmistakable. It belonged to a man who had stood motionless throughout the morning, watching everything with the cold detachment of a predator waiting for weakness to show. Kota. Ezra had seen him earlier on the southern ridge, a tall, broad warrior with copper skin, a square jaw, and a thick braid bound in red cloth. His eyes were like flint, and his hands never strayed far from the tomahawk strapped at his side. He didn't wear rank the way the chief did, but it clung to him just the same. Now he rode forward alone, his horse gliding over the earth like it was part of him. When he stopped in the clearing, every eye turned toward him. His voice came in Apache, first fast, guttural, forceful. Whatever he said sent a ripple through the crowd. Faces hardened. Some nodded, some didn't. Then he switched to English. You protect him, Kota said, looking not at the chief but at the warriors around him. You say he helped her. You say he is different. He turned in his saddle, sweeping his arm toward the cabin. But he is still white, still carries a rifle, still has eyes like all the others before him. Kota stepped forward from the porch. You heard what Ayana said. He didn't touch her. He gave her his bed. Takakota spat in the dirt. Words. A snake can look soft before it bites. A bear can sleep before it kills. Ezra didn't move. He stayed in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other hanging loose. He knew this moment had been coming. It always came, with men like Takakota, the kind who'd lost too much to ever believe again, the kind whose pain had turned to armor. The warrior's voice rose. He kept her. He didn't call for us. He waited. Why? What was he hiding? I didn't know who she was, Ezra answered flatly. Didn't matter. Takakota pointed. Then why save her at all? Because she needed saving. That's not reason. That's a trap. Today you help. Tomorrow you tell soldiers where our trails run. You draw maps. You bring cavalry. Ezra's jaw tightened. I don't talk to soldiers. Takakota's horse snorted and shifted, sensing the energy in its rider. Takakota leaned forward. You think you are good because you waited to hurt her? He hissed. You think restraint is honor? I think kindness is not weakness, Ezra replied. Takakota's laugh was bitter. You breathe our air for one night and think you understand us. I don't understand you, Ezra said, but I do know fear when I see it. A murmur rolled through the line of warriors. Ayana had stepped out again. She stood barefoot in the dust, one hand pressed to the post to steady herself. Her face was drawn, but her eyes were bright, and she was furious. She spoke in Apache, her voice not loud but cutting. Clear. Takakota snapped his gaze toward her. She walked past Ezra without flinching, past Kota, past the fire pit, until she stood just 5 paces from the mounted warrior. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Her words came again low, even, burning with a steady fire. Ezra couldn't understand, but the meaning was plain. There was pain in her voice, shame, fury, but also strength. She spoke of captivity, of wounds, of hands that did not stop hurting. She pointed to her scars and then to Ezra, and shook her head. Kota stepped forward, translating in a whisper, just loud enough for Ezra to hear. She tells him, you washed her cuts without looking at her skin, that you gave her water before food, that you asked for nothing. Even when she cried in her sleep and screamed in Apache, Ayana raised her chin. Her voice caught once, but she pushed through. She tells him, Kota continued, you spoke to her like someone who was still a person. When the others had already stripped that away, Takakota's mouth tightened. He dismounted in one motion. For a split second, Ezra stepped forward, ready, but Ayana didn't flinch. She stood there as Takakota approached, the giant shadow of a man looming over her slight frame. They stood eye to eye. The air crackled with something deeper than threat. It was grief, the kind that turns into rage when left too long inside. Takakota's voice, when it came, was low, broken. She is my cousin, he said. I know, Ayana whispered. I failed her. No, she said. You're failing now. Takakota closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they landed not on Ayana, but on Ezra. He walked slowly, stopping a few feet away. You were not chosen, he said, but you were placed. That matters. For now. He looked back at the ridge, then to the others. But you are watched, white man. You breathe because she asked. You walk because the chief waits. Ezra nodded once. I understand. Takakota stepped back, mounting his horse again without a word. But he didn't ride away. He stayed in the clearing just far enough to signal that this wasn't over. Ayana sagged slightly as she turned and walked back toward Ezra. He reached out, steadying her by the arm. You all right? He asked. She nodded. Then, with a voice hoarse but sure, she said, Now. They listen. Ezra looked out across the warriors and saw that she was right. For the first time, they weren't looking at him like a threat. They were looking at him like a possibility. From the far edge of the camp, Chief Nal Nish raised his hand once again, and this time his voice came not as judgment, but as invitation. The air was still, but the tension hadn't lifted. Not entirely, not yet. Takakota had returned to the outer circle of warriors, but his eyes never left the cabin. The others, too, remained alert, waiting for a command that might still turn the desert red. The only thing that had changed was the space Ayana had carved with her voice, a space that might hold peace, if only barely. Ezra leaned against the door frame, arms crossed loosely over his chest, watching the wind move through the tall, dry grass beyond his fence. His rifle still rested by the doorway, untouched. He hadn't needed it, not because he wasn't in danger, but because something else had started to shift. Something just as powerful as any weapon. Trust, or the beginnings of it. Kota stood beside his sister, his expression calmer now, though his stance remained defensive. Ayana sat on a low stool just inside the doorway, sipping water from a clay cup, her color returning slowly to her face. There was pain in her eyes still, but no longer just the pain of memory. It was layered now with purpose. Ezra had just begun to believe the worst might be over when the chief returned. Chief Nal Nish walked forward from the ring of warriors without his horse this time, his feet stirring dust as he crossed into the heart of Ezra's land. He came alone, and that, Ezra knew, was no small thing. When a man like Nal Nish came without guards, it meant something was about to change. The chief stopped just before the porch. Ezra stepped out to meet him. They faced each other quietly, two men built from different worlds but shaped by the same kind of years, hard, sun-baked, bone-deep years. "You stood your ground," the chief said simply. "She was worth standing for," Ezra replied. Nal Nish looked over Ezra's shoulder into the cabin where Ayana sat. She didn't speak, but she met her father's eyes and nodded once. The chief turned back to Ezra. "My people are not quick to forget harm," he said, "but we also remember those who carry weight when they don't have to." Ezra said nothing. "There are more girls," Nal Nish continued, "not just mine. Apache, Mexican, white, taken from ranches, towns, caravans, sold, traded like livestock." Ezra's jaw tensed. "We tracked the men who took Ayana," the chief said. "Found some of them. Killed most. But there are others, the ones who pay. The ones who buy, and they're still out there," Ezra said. "Yes." A long moment passed between them. "Why are you telling me this?" Ezra asked. "Because you saved one girl," Nal Nish said. "But one girl is not enough." "Not anymore," Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. "You want me to help you hunt them. I want you to prove you meant what you said." Ezra didn't look away. "I don't wear war paint," he said. "I don't ride with banners. I built a quiet life I've kept to myself since the war took my wife and the world stopped making sense." Nal Nish waited. "But," Ezra went on, "I know what it means to lose someone. To feel helpless. To hear someone cry out and know nobody's coming." The chief nodded slowly. "Then maybe you are the kind of man who remembers what he was before the land hardened him." Ezra looked past the chief toward the circle of riders, toward Takakota, toward the young ones with something still wild in their eyes. "What does this look like?" he asked. "They have a camp," Nal Nish said, "near Snake Creek, south of the dry canyon. They are waiting for another wagon, more girls, more misery. We ride before dawn, quiet, fast. We don't go to fight. We go to end." Ezra glanced back at Ayana. She was watching him, not pleading, not pushing, just watching, "What happens if I say no?" he asked. "You stay alive, so," the chief said. "For now. We leave. We carry our dead, our wounded, our stories." Ezra nodded once. "And if I say yes?" Nal Nish's mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something like solemn recognition. "Then you cross a line few have ever crossed." And never returned from Ezra turned back toward the door, as if weighing it. Inside, the fire had burned low. The cabin smelled like pine smoke and old timber, and the faint trace of blood soaked into the floorboards. He looked at his rifle, then back at the chief. "Where do we ride?" Ezra asked. The words landed like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Nal Nish gave a small nod. "We leave at sunset." One meal, one saddle. Nothing else. Ezra reached inside the cabin and grabbed the old saddlebags hanging by the door. He didn't ask more questions. He didn't need to. The moment had already reshaped him. Ayana stood, her body still stiff with healing, and walked to the edge of the porch. "You will ride beside us?" she asked. Ezra met her eyes. "I'm not a warrior." She stepped forward. "You are now." From the ridge, Takakota watched in silence. He gave no signal of approval, but he didn't protest. Ezra saddled his horse that afternoon. He hadn't used the beast in days, had half forgotten what it felt like to ride under open sky with a reason. But as the warriors gathered near the canyon's edge and the sun began to dip, painting the land in gold and fear, he realized something. He had nothing to lose anymore. And finally, he had something worth fighting for. As the last light touched the mountains, a scout rode back from the south. He wasn't alone. And the message he carried would change everything before the first shot was ever fired. They rode without speaking, a ghost line of horses moving through scrub and sagebrush, guided more by instinct than trail. The sky was deep with dusk, the final light bruising the horizon in burnt orange and ash gray. Ezra rode third from the front, just behind Kota and Takakota, who took point like shadows molded into the shape of men. Chief Nal Nish followed silently behind the formation. His presence felt more than heard. Snake Creek was no more than a sliver of dried-out earth this time of year, but the low canyon that ran alongside it made for natural concealment. The Apache war party knew the land better than most men knew their own dreams. Ezra could feel that knowledge in the way they moved, soundless, deliberate, breathing with the terrain instead of against it. They dismounted just before the final ridge. Takakota raised a clenched fist, and everyone froze in place. Ezra crouched beside him, heart thudding in his chest. The old burn scar under his ribs pulsed like it had in the war years, just before something awful always broke loose. Kota pointed through a narrow slit in the rock. Ezra leaned in and looked down. Below, in a clearing shaded by dead cottonwoods and surrounded by half-collapsed cliffs, the slavers' camp sprawled like a festering wound. 3 wagons sat in a rough circle, iron cages bolted onto their backs. Inside, figures huddled, some sitting, some lying down, others curled in corners with arms wrapped tight around their knees. It was hard to count how many. 15, 20. Most were women. Some barely more than children. Near a low-burning fire, 6 men lounged, laughing between swigs from dented tin cups. 2 more walked patrols with rifles slung lazy over their shoulders, but their posture told Ezra what he needed to know. They weren't expecting anyone. A scout returned from the south, slipping between Ezra and Kota. He said something in Apache, Kota translated with a glance. "They're expecting another delivery." From north of Larkspur. Tonight Ezra's jaw clenched. He looked again at the cages, at the iron locks, at the small, pale face pressed to the bars nearest the fire. A girl, no older than 12. Chief Nal Nish knelt behind them, his voice low. Takakota and I lead the northern charge. When the men move to meet us, you and Kota go from the west. You reach the wagons, break them open, get them out. Ezra nodded. We bring them up the ridge? Yes. That's the only safe route. But if they're too slow... We hold the line, Ezra said, finishing the sentence. The chief met his eyes. No ceremony, no blessing, just war. They waited until the fire in the camp died low, until the stars blinked clear above the canyon rim. Then the silence broke. A cry rose from the North Takakota's war howl, unmistakable and fierce. Arrows cut through the sky before the slavers even knew where to aim. Screams followed. The camp exploded into chaos. Ezra and Kota charged from the west, weaving between jagged rocks, rifles raised. The first slaver never saw Ezra coming. He was a broad man, scarred across the cheek, fumbling with his belt buckle when the bullet caught him between the ribs. He dropped like a sack of meal. Kota moved like lightning, dropping 2 more with his bow before their rifles ever came up. Ezra sprinted toward the first cage, heart hammering. The lock was heavy, rusted, but gave way under the second swing of his hatchet. The door creaked open. Inside were 3 women. One tried to crawl out, sobbing. Another pulled her back, terrified. "We're here to get you out," Ezra said quickly, crouching. "You're safe now." Go, they didn't move. Ezra grabbed the first by the wrist, gently, firmly, and pulled her out. She screamed. From behind the wagon, a guard rose, shotgun aimed. Ezra turned, pulling the girl behind him. Before the blast could sound, Kota dropped the man with an arrow straight to the throat. "Next cage," Kota shouted. Ezra moved fast. Another lock. Another group. One of the girls was slumped near the bars, blood soaking her skirt. She wasn't moving. Ezra dropped to his knees, checking for a pulse. Faint. But there. He hoisted her gently, cradling her like he had Ayana on the night she fell into his life. Her body was limp, her skin clammy, but her chest still rose. Behind him, gunfire rang out again. Screams echoed off canyon walls. One of the slavers had taken cover behind a fallen log, firing blindly into the shadows. Takakota's silhouette appeared like a vengeful ghost, tomahawk flashing. The slaver went down in a heap. Ezra carried the unconscious girl to the base of the ridge, laying her beside 2 others, already waiting to be pulled up by rope. "Go!" he barked to the woman beside her. "You climb." "Hold her tight." She hesitated, then nodded, face streaked with dirt and tears. The Apache above threw down a loop, and the 3 began their slow ascent. Ezra turned back toward the final wagon. A scream split the air. One of the slavers had grabbed a woman by the hair, dragging her from a cage, pistol pressed against her jaw. His hand shook as he shouted into the dark, "Back off, or I'll shoot her where she stands." Everything stopped. For a heartbeat, even the wind died. Ezra stepped forward, rifle raised. "Let her go," he called out. The slaver turned. His eyes were red-rimmed, teeth yellow. His grip on the girl was tightening, dragging her like a doll. Ezra didn't wait. He fired. The man dropped before the echo finished rolling through the canyon. The girl collapsed beside him, screaming. Ezra rushed to her, pulling her free and lifting her to her feet. "It's over," he said. "You're going home." She just sobbed, clinging to his arm. By the time the last cage was opened, 6 slavers lay dead. 2 had tried to flee and were cut down before they cleared the canyon. One was captured alive, snarling and spitting as Takakota bound his wrists with rough sinew. Ezra stood in the center of the broken camp, breathing hard, sweat soaking through his shirt. His hands trembled, not from fear, from fury. Fury that men like this walked the same earth. Chief Nal Nish approached slowly, stepping over the body of a dead slaver. "You did well," the chief said. Ezra looked around, at the freed captives, at the women huddled in blankets, whispering thanks between sobs. "I did what had to be done." Takakota stepped forward, nodding at him. "You fight like Apache." "I fight like a man with nothing left to lose," Ezra said. "You have more now than you know." Ezra turned toward the ridge where Ayana waited with the others. She stood beneath the stars, bruised but unbroken, eyes locked on him. She didn't speak. She just gave one slow, solemn nod. And Ezra knew this wasn't the end. There were more camps, more cages, more ghosts in the dark waiting to be pulled into the light. The fire burned low, flickering shadows against the canyon walls, painting every face with the weary weight of victory. The camp at Snake Creek had fallen silent. No more gunfire, no screams, no iron bars rattling under terrified fists. Just the soft murmur of breath and the rustling of blankets around those who had been rescued. 23 souls, 23 women and children who only hours earlier had been prisoners with no names and no future. Now they were free. Ezra sat alone near the edge of the clearing, his shirt still damp with sweat, blood drying on the sleeve that had pressed against a dying girl's wound. His rifle leaned against a rock beside him, the barrel still warm. Across the fire, Kota knelt beside a young woman who couldn't stop shaking, wrapping her in a heavy blanket and murmuring in their language. Nearby, 2 older warriors quietly prepared burial markers for their fallen, a cost paid in blood, but one they accepted without complaint. Takakota stood with his back to the fire, arms crossed, watching the flickering glow. His face was unreadable. Ezra expected the quiet to stretch forever. But then Ayana approached. She was limping slightly, her ribs still healing, but she walked with purpose. She carried something in her hand, a thin strip of leather strung with small carved bones and polished river stones. It was simple, no larger than a man's wrist, but it glowed faintly in the firelight, like it held a piece of the land inside it. Ezra stood as she came closer. She held it out to him. He didn't reach for it right away, not out of hesitation but respect. "What's this?" he asked quietly. Ayana looked him in the eyes. "Apache do not speak thanks with too many words," she said, "but we remember with what we give." He nodded slowly, then held out his arm. She tied the bracelet around his wrist, her fingers gentle and firm. "You are not Apache," she said softly, "but today the spirits of our mothers saw your soul." And they did not turn away. Ezra swallowed, his throat thick. "I only did what was right." "Then you did what few do," she replied. Takakota stepped forward, his boots crunched lightly in the dust. The same man who had once demanded Ezra be killed now stood tall before him, shoulders squared. He didn't speak for a long while. Then he nodded once and said the word in English, quiet but strong. "Brother." Ezra didn't answer with words. He just extended his hand. Takakota looked down at it, then grasped it firmly. The other warriors around the fire watched, silent. But something had changed. The tightness in their stances softened. The glances were no longer suspicion, but recognition. Chief Nal Nish approached, his expression solemn but proud. He placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. "You walked through our fire," he said, "and you did not burn. You stood for someone who was not yours, and in doing so, became one of us." Ezra lowered his gaze, not from shame, but humility. "I didn't come here looking for anything," he said. "Didn't think I had anything left to give." "And yet you gave," the chief replied. "That is the mark of a warrior." Around them, preparations for departure began. The rescued women would be taken to different homes. Apache, Mexican, settler families sympathetic to the cause. Some would return to towns that never looked for them. Others would begin new lives among strangers who'd risked their own lives to save them. Ezra helped where he could, securing wagons, checking bindings, offering water. When all was nearly ready, he returned to the ridge where his horse waited. Ayanna stood there. She looked out over the canyon one last time. "I used to think I was small," she said. "Not worth chasing. Not worth saving." Ezra shook his head. "They were wrong. Every one of them." She turned to face him. "My people saw me tonight," she said. "But you saw me when no one else was looking." He didn't answer. The moment didn't need more words. "You'll go back to your cabin?" she asked. "For now," he said. She stepped closer. "Then I'll know where to find you." He smiled, just barely. "Any time." As the Apache riders began their slow descent from Snake Creek, Ezra climbed into the saddle, the bracelet still warm against his wrist. But he didn't ride back the same man. The road ahead held something else now, because while the battle had been won, he knew, as surely as he knew the weight of his rifle, that evil didn't end in one canyon. And somewhere in the shadows, someone else was preparing to sell a girl like Ayanna. That was the part that never stopped. But now, neither would he. The wind was different now. It came down from the hills, softer than before, brushing across the plains like fingers over old pages. Dust still kicked up from the canyon rim, and the scent of cedar and dry grass still clung to the boards of Ezra's cabin. But something in the air had changed. It no longer spoke of ghosts. It whispered of something left behind, and something waiting ahead. Ezra Mallory rode the last mile slow. His horse moved without hurry, instinct pulling it down the same trail it had taken 100 times before. But for Ezra, each step felt new. He passed the ridge where he first spotted Ayanna crawling from the brush, barely alive. He passed the dry creek bed where he'd once buried the tiny cross carved for his unborn child. And when the cabin finally came into view, bathed in golden light, he stopped. Everything was where he'd left it. The porch, the rocking chair, the pair of boots tipped against the wall that hadn't fit him in years. But it didn't feel like the place he'd abandoned. It felt like it had been waiting for him to return. He dismounted and tied the reins loosely. The silence around him wasn't empty now. It was full of everything that had come before. The gunfights, the betrayal, the redemption, the memory of 23 freed souls. And the moment Ayanna placed the bracelet on his wrist, binding him to something deeper than blood. Inside, the cabin was cool and dim. Dust motes danced in the sunbeam cutting through the curtain. On the mantel, the photograph of his late wife still sat in its cracked wooden frame. Her smile had faded slightly in the years since she passed, but today it seemed softer, as if she too knew something had shifted. Ezra walked to the table. That's when he saw it. The bracelet. Ayanna's gift. But this one was different. It wasn't the one tied to his wrist days ago. This was another smaller, thinner, carved with more care. The bones polished so fine they shimmered like pearl in the afternoon light. A strand of dark hair had been woven into the leather. She'd left it here by choice, beside the photograph, not beneath it, not hidden, as if to say one memory does not replace another. It walks beside it. Ezra picked it up gently, cradling it in his palm. The heat of the desert sun still clung to it, even inside. He pressed it to his heart, closed his eyes. Out on the porch, he settled into the rocking chair. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying the world alone. He wasn't waiting for death anymore. He was waiting for something else, something that might never come with fanfare, or gunfire, or glory, but might show up quiet, in the form of a visitor. A knock, a young voice, a need. Or maybe just a whisper of wind carrying the memory of a girl who called him the man who saw me. He watched the sun begin its descent, spilling golden light across the plains like a spilled jar of honey. The horses in the corral stirred. A hawk circled high above, steady and wide. Ezra reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter. It was worn and folded 100 times, but unopened. The return address read, Arizona Territory, Northern Apache Settlement. He hadn't needed to open it yet, because she'd already said everything that mattered without writing a word. Still, someday he would, and when he did, he'd ride. Because Ezra Mallory was no longer just a man with a rifle and a ghost. He was something more now. A witness, a protector, a bridge between what was lost and what could still be saved. Not a legend, not a hero, but a man who chose to do the right thing when no one asked him to, and in the world they all lived in, that might just be the rarest thing of all. From the quiet edges of his cabin, Ezra watched the last light fade behind the hills, and for the first time in years, he smiled, like stories where justice rides on horseback and hearts are healed under desert skies. Subscribe to Western Legacy now and join us next week for a brand new tale. One ranch, one outlaw, one little girl with a secret that could change the frontier forever.